Good morning. The issues or the topics that I would like to discuss today are think tanks and lobbying. The reason I've made a section of the syllabus on this is our course is called Press Coverage of Politics and Policy. So I thought it would be useful at this point in the semester to say a few words about where policy comes from. You may think that it's brought by the stork, that it's hatched in a nursery. Actually, the second example there is better, but those nurseries are often think tanks or lobbying groups. So let's look at what each of them is. A think tank is intended to be a collection of scholars housed more or less in the same place, sometimes in one building, sometimes on a campus of many buildings. In that way, it's similar to a institution like a college or a university, although it rarely involves any teaching responsibilities. Think tanks exist to bring in researchers and scholars of many different interests. Some think tanks are quite narrow in what they focus on. The Urban Institute, for instance, focuses largely on urban issues, and other are much broader in terms of what they look at, like the Brookings Institution or the Hoover Institution. Now, for the most part, think tanks are identified with a political point of view. Not everyone. Some are insistent that they are nonpartisan, and you have to look at their work to decide that for yourself. But many of them will say they reflect conservative values. Others will say they fight to preserve progressive values. And the way these organizations work, almost all of them are nonprofit. They receive money sometimes from groups. Labor unions, for instance, contribute funds to support left of center think tanks. Conservative organizations and wealthy donors on both sides give money to support think tanks that develop policies that have a point of view. There are literally thousands of policies that are being developed at any given time. And what I want to do today is just take note of a few issues that are out there that we're hearing about every day. And in what I hope will be a refreshing pause from either worrying about the presidential election or the pandemic, I thought I'd focus on the other current disaster, which is the terrible fires raging on the West Coast. What we see out there, aside from the devastation and the heroic efforts to try to save people and their homes, are certain policies that are either in effect or not in effect that are raising some questions. For instance, some people have suggested there should be federal safety standards involving home construction and their proximity to forests, and that there should be a safe border, say 10 feet or 20 feet between the edge of the property, the edge of the lawn, and the surrounding forest. And the idea of that is that as a fire rages through a forest, that it will not be able to leap over the gap and destroy the house. This seems like a common sense proposal and a good policy to have. But what gets in the way is several issues. And one is, should this be a federal policy, or should each state decide for its own? So in fact, this is one of those issues that has been left to the states, and different states have different rules. One thing that has become clear in California, as each year they have a wave of devastating fires, is that they need to take some action, and so they have adopted a policy that was first suggested to them by fire safety experts and then endorsed by insurance experts that called for the creation of this kind of safety strip around properties. But California decided to apply it only to new residences. that is, homes being built once the policy was adopted. The experts have said, well, there are many more existing homes than there are new homes, and many of them are at risk, so why not apply this policy? And the state's political leaders discussed this and decided that it's simply too expensive and would be very unpopular to go to people and tell them that they would have to rework their properties, destroy trees on their properties, expand their lawns, add in a lot of safety measures at their own cost. And so here's a case where we have a sensible policy, but it's been adopted only in a very, very limited way. Another policy issue that I just wanted to call to your attention is various aspects of the tax code derive from certain policies, and those policies sometimes come from economics and analysis, and they sometimes come from ideology and beliefs. And if you look at the history of the U.S. tax code and how it's changed, you can see this play out. The first federal income tax was created relatively early in the 20th century. And a few decades later, Congress decided that the interest on home mortgages should be deductible from your taxes. That means that if you have a mortgage and you pay interest on it, you reduce your taxable income by the amount of your mortgage payment. So your income is less, so you owe less tax. I'm belaboring this point for those of you who don't own property and deal with mortgages. The rationale for this was essentially a belief that home ownership was good and that it promotes stability in communities, that if people own property and live there, they're likely to care more about their neighborhoods and their towns than if they rent. There's data both for and against this, but it was essentially a policy decision that Congress made to encourage home ownership. And it worked. But somewhere along the line, Congress decided, well, if you own a second home, if you own a weekend house or a summer house, that the mortgage interest on that should be deducted as well. Now, it's harder there if you think about the economics of this, how is it in the public interest to encourage wealthier people to own a second home? What purpose does that serve? It doesn't stabilize a community the way a primary residence does. And I should note here, it's not just a second home. If you own 3 homes or 4 homes, or 4 homes and luxury apartments in major cities, the mortgage interest on all of those is tax deductible. That's also true if you own a boat, provided it's a boat that you sleep on for at least 14 days a year. So when you think about how this plays out, and there's ample data to support this, people who own multiple homes or boats that they can sleep on are allowed to deduct the cost of their mortgages or loans from their annual income. So that brings down their annual income, brings down their taxable income, and they pay less taxes. And therefore, the public has less money because it is supporting these purchases. Does this policy make sense? I don't think so. Many experts agree with me. Many experts on the other side say it's still an important principle. More recently, let's say in the last 15 or 20 years, as our cities have grown and many people have come to the cities who want to settle in a city but can't afford a home there, they rent. And they're very unhappy with this discrepancy in the tax code, because if you own property and pay mortgage interest, that's tax deductible. If you pay rent, it's not tax deductible. So in some ways, it's more expensive with no long-term benefit, such as ownership, if you rent. And why do we have a policy that discriminates against renters? These are fair questions, and they're ones that are debated both in Congress and by the different think tanks that support different points of view with their analysis. Another example of where policy comes from is lobbying groups and lobbyists. And there are lots of different types of lobbying groups, but often they are organizations that represent a specific industry, like cement makers will have their own lobbying group. One that you may have heard of is the Consumer Electronics Association, which every year has a big show out west to show off new products, all sorts of consumer electronics. The members of that group are manufacturers and retailers of consumer electronics, and they lobby for different policies, say on the rules for disposing of old computers and how you do that safely. Are you responsible for the battery, or do you just throw it in the garbage? Are there rules on that? Are there rules on auto safety, on disposing of used auto oil, on what professions require licenses? All of these are policy decisions. They're sometimes grounded in common sense and sometimes not. I mean, if you think about it, why does a barber or a hairdresser have to have a license? Like, why do they have to be certified by the government? Isn't this something you could trust to the marketplace and say, either you give someone a good haircut and your skills support you, or you develop a bad reputation and your business fails? I mean, that's sort of the essence of capitalism. But by having a licensing system, you limit the number of entries and make it harder for new people to enter businesses. And this is one of the goals of such organizations of professionals, to limit access and therefore reduce competition. We see this in many aspects of our lives as well. I mean, if you think about, let's say you want to buy a beer. In New York State, if you want to buy a beer, there are many grocery stores that are licensed to sell beer, including most supermarkets, most neighborhood delis and bodegas. On the other hand, if you want to buy a bottle of wine, you can't go to a supermarket and buy a bottle of wine. You have to go to a liquor store or a vineyard. And, what's the logic of that? Why is it safe to buy beer or safe to sell beer in a supermarket, but not to sell wine? And the answer to why it's done this way is that owners of liquor stores have bonded together to form a lobbying group to fight supermarket sales. Now, different states have different laws. If you are in Vermont or in California, you can go into a supermarket and it will sell beer, it will sell wine, and it will sell hard liquor as well. So some states permit it, some states don't. If you cross the Hudson River into New Jersey, you will find that there are stores that sell beer and wine, whereas in New York they're sold differently. There was an attempt made in Albany a few years ago at the state legislature to introduce legislation that would allow supermarkets to sell wine. And winemakers wanted this because they would get wider distribution, so their organization was lobbying for it. Supermarkets wanted this because they thought it would bring them more sales. The owners of neighborhood liquor stores vigorously opposed this because it would take away business. And they prevailed. They did a better job of getting Albany's ear. Maybe it was through historical relationships and friendships. Maybe it was through more powerful lobbying and more spending of money. But you can look at many areas of public life and find the effect of lobbying and of think tanks on policies that are developed. We see this now in the New York City area all over the place, where there's been a big push in the last, I guess I would say during the de Blasio mayoralty, for increased bicycle use. And the construction of bicycle lanes. And there are many good reasons to do this, but one of the things that I don't think was accounted for is you had all the advocates who were pointing out how this is good for the environment, it's good for people's health because they get exercise. It reduces the crush of mass transportation and traffic. But they don't seem to have accounted for the impact of bike lanes, because when you do have bike lanes, there are two notable things. One is you have more accidents involving bikes, both bicycles and pedestrians, and bicycles and vehicles. And there's actually been a jump in the number of deaths of bicyclists being hit by vehicles. This was perhaps not factored into the decision making to do this, or figuring out a safe way to do this. At the same time, having bicycle lanes, the bicycle lanes come out of the existing street, not of the sidewalk, so they reduce the capacity. So while there are many good reasons for bicycles in New York and to encourage cyclists in New York, and there are many organizations that are lobbying for more, at the same time, we're reducing the capacity of New York's streets. And these policies began to take effect just at the point where Uber and Lyft were beginning to grow. So the streets were getting narrower at the same time that tens of thousands of vehicles were being added to the streets. So traffic grew much worse, time stuck in traffic, loss of productivity. Some of this was foreseeable. Sorry, just kicked my camera. This is foreseeable, or might have been foreseeable, but rather than approaching it as a problem to be solved, you had policymakers focused on one point of view. So I think it's useful, as you're writing about public policies and press coverage of them, to think about where they come from. Rules on farming, government policies in support of farming, food safety rules. Often these reflect science, including economics, but often they affect the lobbying and pressure of lobbying groups. I could sit here all day and give you hundreds more examples, but I think you get the general idea. But let me just throw a couple of other pieces of info out on the table. If you know anything about automobile tires, and people in the suburbs probably know more about this than people in New York City, tires come with different ratings. Aside from their dimension, their diameter and their thickness and the size of their tread, they also come with ratings for the highest appropriate speed. And the numbers are often preposterously high. This one is rated as safe at 175 miles an hour, as if anybody would do that outside of a racetrack. But the point I wanted to make is the federal government established these standards, but then decided that it was up to the tire makers themselves to test them and assign the numbers. So it's a weird policy. It's a safety policy, but there's no enforcement. The tire makers develop tires, they test them, they decide what rating to give them, and then those tires are brought to market with that label. A similar process goes on with meat inspection, and we're probably more aware of meat inspection since meat, various types of meat and various types of chicken periodically produce illnesses. And you've all heard of The Jungle, even if you haven't read it, the book by Upton Sinclair, published in about 1905, that exposed the complete lack of sanitary conditions at the meat processing plants in Chicago. So there are now safety guidelines. There are policy specialists and lobbyists who are arguing for more humane ways of farming and for killing the animals whose flesh we will then eat. But the different grades of meat, for instance, is this prime? Is this choice? Is this select? Again, it's the industry that decides what grade a piece of meat is. You take a cow, you kill it, you cut it up. You take the different parts of meat and you assign the label to it. Is this prime meat? Is this special meat? There is some public inspection, and it focuses more on sanitation and cleanliness and health issues, not the gradation. But personally, I think this is sort of weird that you're asking manufacturers to tell you what the quality is, or to create their own standards, rather than having inspectors trained in this who had no stake in the outcome creating that policy. So I think that one final example, speed limits. I see that NYPD announced just last week that it had noticed that during the pandemic, when there has been a good deal less traffic in Manhattan, that more people are driving quickly. There are people who are street racing. There are people who are just driving faster than they ever were able to because there's less traffic. And the NYPD designated 9 streets on which it was lowering the speed limit. Speed limit is sort of a set of policies that derive from common sense and some research. And you have researchers who are looking at what speed is the safest for drivers and other drivers and pedestrians and crosswalks, and what speed produces the best fuel efficiency. There was a time where as you drove across the United States, the speed limit kept getting higher and higher. It was 55 in New York and New Jersey, and then when you went into Pennsylvania, it went to 60. When you went into, it was 60 in Ohio, and then in Indiana, it became 65. And then when you crossed into Iowa, it became 70. In Nebraska, it was 75. In Wyoming, it was 80 miles an hour. I'm just tracing Route 80, which runs from the George Washington Bridge to San Francisco. So in Wyoming, it was 80 miles an hour. And then when you went down into Nevada, there was no speed limit at all. And then the speed limit was reestablished at 75 when you first entered Northern California. These are policies that are supposed to find a balance between saving people time, fuel efficiency, and safety. We know that if you drive 50 miles an hour, it's safer for other drivers, it's safer for other pedestrians, it's better for your fuel mileage, but it takes a lot more time. And so governments struggle to find the right balance, and they're often influenced in that decision making by automakers, tire makers, pedestrian safety groups, and so on. And often, and I think some of the readings this week demonstrate that, how lobbyists will be able to persuade government to adopt different rules, or how lobbyists will be able to persuade a legislature to make changes in a public park, and it's done in such a sneaky way that most of the legislators who voted for the bill didn't even know this provision was in it. Of course, that's on the legislators. They shouldn't be voting until they've read things. But this happens every year when the New York State legislature finally gets to vote on a state budget. And one of the items in that is the money allocated to CUNY, so we should all care about that. The budget bill is typically more than 1,000 pages long, and the final version is sometimes not put in legislators' hands until midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning, and they vote on it the next morning. So it's quite reasonable to assume that most of them haven't read it, and many of them don't know what's in the bill. So these are defects in the system, but in this particular week, I just wanted you to think about where policies come from, how policies are changing. We see this in the news every day in some of the public health debates about the pandemic. Should there be a federal requirement to wear masks? Wouldn't that be the safest thing? Well, many people say yes. Many people say no. Some of them say no based on their ideology. And there was some sheriff out west, I think in New Mexico, who said that he was not going to enforce the local mask law because it was a struggle between safety and freedom. He would come down on the side of freedom. So if you define your choices that way, it leaves you with a certain set of policies. And if you define them, if you value safety more than personal freedom, you would come up with different answers. One issue that we still don't know the answer to yet is if a safe vaccine is tested and developed and then distributed, will some people refuse to be inoculated? And of course they will. We know that already because there's a growing movement of people who refuse to have their children inoculated. And at the same time, we see a growth of diseases that we thought had been eradicated, like measles, flaring up. And people in those cases are making a judgment that their personal freedom is more important to them than government safety policies. And, that's their choice to make in many parts of America. And so we see policies there that value individual freedom and choice more than public safety. So on some of these issues, you probably have strong opinions, and that's fine. And they may not agree with mine, and that's fine too. But what you always have to think about is you may have these beliefs, but there are other people who have differing beliefs, and we're all trying to live in the same society together. So how do we reconcile them, and what responsibility do we have to protect the beliefs of others? In some ways, that's easier when you're talking about religious beliefs than when you're talking about public health issues or traffic safety issues. But I just wanted you to think of this as background. If you look on the syllabus this week, there are a couple of dozen links to different types of think tanks and lobbying groups. There's no specific assignment to dig into them, but I thought it would help you see this big picture if you browse them on almost any issue you can think of: air pollution, public education, nutrition. There are different points of view and different arguments being made, and in some cases different sets of research that are offered in support of those points of view. So that's the goal of this week's reading, and then in subsequent weeks we will start looking at various areas of policy and seeing how the press covers them. But I wanted you to just this week, through the readings and some research, just have a foundation in place for where and how policies are formed. If you have any questions either about these comments or about any of the readings, please email me and I will get back to you very promptly. Thank you.